Hello, we're going to look at some of the major steps involved in information management. So the following things we're going to go through could be done in a cycle. They could repeat, might be done in different orders depending on the different circumstances. But really all the things we're going to talk about are things which, as somebody working in information management and IT generally, you should be aware of. So starting with actually getting information in the first place and holding it so you can do stuff to it later. Well, you've got to first of all collect, then store, then retrieve your information. Now this is, the collection part of that is actually getting the data in the first place. So of course, the actual collection method will depend a lot on what exactly you're doing, but it could be through surveys, through market research, through deploying a loyalty scheme, for example. You're getting lots of data, then you've got to decide where to actually hold it. And also, how you're going to access it later on. That's what retrieving means, where you access it after you've got it stored. So storing is not just a temporary, we're holding it for a little bit. Usually this is a permanent storage, and most of the time, not always, but most of the time this will be in a database. So the database is our software, but of course the data has to get stored on the actual hardware using some storage media like a magnetic hard drive. And so the person in charge of this will have to weigh up what device to use, what database software to use, what structure should the database have. And once you've got a database with a good structure, you are able to access it fairly easily through things called queries. You can see we've got 4 queries in this database here. A query is a question to the database, so you can ask it for certain information and it will extract it quickly for you. Now you've also got to, as someone in charge of this process, think a lot about security. And we're going to have future videos on security in more detail, but if you have sensitive information being stored, you should encrypt it. Encryption is making the data unreadable for anyone without a password, effectively. Now the phrase "at rest" is used for encryption on storage, so the data is not going anywhere on a storage device, and so it's said to be at rest. Now encryption is not the only method you should deploy. There should ideally be other security. Maybe you've got locks and security guards and antivirus also being deployed, which is going to come at a cost, both in terms of time but also expertise, alongside having to actually pay for all of these security methods. But as hopefully you are aware of, the consequence of not having good security can be even greater. If you had a cyber attack and lots of sensitive information was leaked, you could have a big reputational damage. You could also be sued, could also be fined, and so the cost can be even greater if you don't secure it in the first place. But once you do have your data stored somewhere, you are able to move on to what can often be the next stage, but not necessarily. This is actually where you manipulate and process the data. So in effect, this is where you start to make changes to the data. And this will lead to it becoming information, definitely. Information is really processed data. Data on its own is just a raw fact, which doesn't really tell us much. Once you process it, you can start to gain meaning from it, and so it is described as information. So if it is a relatively simple business, a relatively simple set of data, you may be able to use a spreadsheet to do this processing. So I've given this example before of me plugging in some numbers from a test I did with one of my classes, and the spreadsheet, after I wrote some formulae, outputted the grades and comparison to the targets, and even the percentages were calculated, were processed by the spreadsheet. So that's good for simple scenarios. There are more advanced processing tools available, especially for big businesses. But a lot of the time, this stage, if it is a stage, will be getting the information in a format which is ready to be analysed. For raw data on its own, it would be very difficult to analyse, but if it is in a processed, cleaned, useful format, you can then do what can be the next stage, which is analysis. So analysis is where you are looking for patterns and trends in the data. You're trying to gain some understanding from the data you have, and really you could argue that's information at that stage. So again, you could use something like Excel, a spreadsheet software, to generate some graphs for you, and the graphs can make it a little bit easier to view these patterns, view these trends. A lot of the time the key decisions will arise from analysis, so what the company will do will be based on the analysis of their data. And finally, one more step which could really come at any point if this was a cycle, which is transmission. When you are transmitting things, you are sending it from one place to another. Now this might be, for example, sending a client your findings. You might do some analysis for a client and send it to them afterwards. It might be you moving data from one office to another. It might be you receiving data from somebody else. So this transmission could happen in any stage really, but it's important because as soon as the data leaves your control, it becomes at risk to things like interception. So if data is intercepted, it means somebody on the path from you to your client, say, is able to view and see the data, which if it's sensitive would obviously be very serious because again, you might suffer reputational loss, you might have identity theft, you might have fines coming from government if you were not careful enough. And so again, you should encrypt the data. This time, when the data is moving, it's said to be in transit. So you need to encrypt in sort of two places, both at rest, but also when it is moving, when it is in transit. This can sometimes come at a cost of speed. If you're wanting to send lots of data and you've got to encrypt it, that can be quite slow, add some time onto the process, but ultimately it is something you should really be doing if the information is sensitive.